Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming back for the reading, which I hope will be of interest to you. I'm not going to put the text of the poems on screen because in the spirit of Mr. Hopkins, I want you to listen, hopefully without distraction, to the poems, but I will attempt to read them to you in such a way that you have plenty of time to think about the words. So that's the reason why I'm not putting them up on screen. So I hope that that's okay with you. Once again, thank you very much for inviting me to Monasterevin. As far back as I can recall, I've loved words, their sound, the effects that they have, the combinations that they produce on the human psyche. My parents were both teachers and also lovers of poetry. I was very lucky, and they were very conscious of the power of words. My mother read me Beatrix Potter from the age of about 2, and my father, who was of the benevolent patrician school of teaching as a primary school headmaster, took me under his wing to do English exercises from a traditional textbook that taught you such collective nouns as a brace of pheasants, a skein of geese, and my favorite, an unkindness of ravens. So the first poem that I'm going to read evokes that Welsh heritage that kind of started me on the road. And it's from a sequence of poems entitled Across Country from my last collection, Exile and the Kingdom. The very title is a translation of the word pilgrimage, which derives from the Latin per ager, across country. And it describes the start of one of the many long car journeys I did as a child from London to holiday with my grandmother in Wales. They always began before dawn because this was in the days before motorways crisscrossed the country and the journey was long. And that early rising always gave a secret kind of mythical aspect to the endeavour. So across country. There are a couple of place names which are of districts in London, if you know London. How it all begins. This is what gets forgotten, unwilled and inarticulate. The dark start in the morning, being carried by gods out into the starry night. We are silent to ourselves. No familiar landscapes, no lintel, ingle nook to shape or stable space. Just the road and its rhythms. The reindeer saddle and the motor car, the sighing desert and the plateau wind etch the first surfaces of particularity and settle in our souls. I tasted the cold scent of before dawn and awoke. The streets were hollow and strange. My father and mother threaded upriver past milestones shadowy in the neon lamplight, Catford, Dulwich, Tulse Hill and Wandsworth, to the great wall of the way west at Kew. The city tipped and hinged, and we crossed over the frontier into a translated land. Land of water, land of stone, the hard Lord treaders work their faith in bone. Land of tabernacles, land of holy wells, land where coracles sail to holy cells. Land of baptism, land of rain, Bethlehem, Bethesda, Gethsemane raised again. Land of entrance, where the God draws in to set himself the fording place out of sin. Land of rivers, the Christ cross prayer, land where I first put my foot upon the holy stair. So that's a poem about my connection with Wales, but my connection with London is just as strong. My mother was born in Bermondsey and grew up in great poverty under the shadow of the Tower of London. That wouldn't happen these days for a whole variety of reasons. It was a tough life, and as a child she played on the streets, as did everyone in those days. And the most illicit pleasure was to hang onto the back of the dray carts. We talked about dray horses earlier in Will's talk. Dray carts delivering barrels of beer around the city and be pulled over the join at the centre of Tower Bridge. Very dangerous. So though poor and underprivileged, in this poem, my mother becomes like a bird at the centre of the world. She was only about 7 or 8 when she used to do this. Southwark, 1927. Hooves clink, a knocking in the stalls of frothy horse excitement as they hear the barrels drum. The doors burst open. Out leap the fiery chargers and their dark keeper. Out past the silent hospitals and dripping barges, Tooley Street, Grace Street, Spice Wharf and Tower Bridge. Whoa! Wait a moment. Hydraulics tick in the mist as a little gaggle creeps with its one roller skate behind the juggernaut. I dares you, cowardly custard. Don't be sissy. I'll give you threepence if you do it. He won't see. So she binds the sandal on and grasps the tailboard. The tower tops are invisible in cloud. Whip clicks, and with a jolt, the great feet ram the tarmac. The air's a sudden corridor of wind down which she hurtles. Eyes flattened, hair aflame, she shoots the frontier of the hemispheres. Girders, hinges, railings accordioning past, seagulls careening, the river far below, a wall of water. The sinews of the mighty horses revolving the wheels of the world. Where across, the horizon sighs slightly. Her fingers are claws of pain. The roller skates catching on the curb's edge, bouncing. Here, what the devil? Little ragamuffin, get out of it! She pokes her tongue out, scampers under the steaming nostrils, imps into the mist. I still live in London in the valley of the Lee to the east. It's an area of wetland and home to that, or a passage place for thousands of migratory birds, a site of special scientific interest, and I feel very privileged to live here. Right on its edge lie both Epping Forest, one of the royal hunting forests saved from development in the 19th century, and where the lodge from which Elizabeth I would watch the sport still stands. And also at its edge lies the City of London Cemetery, the largest in Europe, an area also of park and woodland. And in it lies buried my first step-grandchild, who was stillborn, and her name is Scarlet Rose. Scarlet Rose. Out in the marsh lies Scarlet Rose, where the Black Lee through its mud banks past Old Ford and Three Mills and the Roman road flows. Do you hear their feet flying? The tramp of men dying for empire again and again, ever since we first cut down the alders with stone. Out in the marsh lies Scarlet Rose. The deer run on Epping Hill, and the beeches ring with groves of blackbirds and the dun of hooves. Look at the wild kites and model airplanes chasing their tails in the clouds. Look at the shroud of the dead queen in her hunting lodge and the staircases of power. Out in the marsh lies Scarlet Rose, who smiled in the darkness and never saw day or night. Cities stand still. Tyrants and governments drop beneath the tides. The Lee flows past their graveyard to the sea. I read French and German at university, and part of my professional life, a large part of my professional life, was spent teaching these two languages. So over the years, both countries have become like second homes to me. And the next poem is from a sequence called Rhine Fugue, in which I speak of the river's importance over many centuries as barrier and frontier, source of wealth, meeting place and streams of exchange, one of the great foci of Europe. The poem evokes the historic moment when Marshal Blucher's Prussian and Russian forces, on their way ultimately to Waterloo, crossed the river at dead of night in a magnificently planned stealth operation to catch the French, who were then occupying the west bank of the Rhine, unawares. But you will hear that it's really about how ordinary people are caught up in the horrors of war. There are two place names, the villages of Perscheid and Steg. And the Tartar horsemen brought by the Russian forces had a very different riding style from that of the Prussians or indeed Rhinelanders. They rode their horses like the Mongols that they were, or at least where they'd come from, the Great Plains, the steppe. And the person speaking is somebody who knows this lady called Jutta. New Year's Day, 1814, Blucher crosses the Rhine. We had it from Daynet's daughter, Jutta, the one who married over the river, a man from Perscheid, God help her. They were moving oxen in the farmyard when the toddler slipped and cracked her head on the ice. So she had her in her arms and was comforting her with a stick of sugar. Suddenly, the mist lifted. The sky was blue as a plover's egg. Look up there at the moon ghost, she said to the child. In that moment, she heard it, like 1,000 altar bells, which she thought very odd, since Christmas was over and she was not in church. What's that noise coming up from Steg? She asked her husband, and saw, within the pale of his eye, as he gazed over her shoulder, row on row of black coats bobbing, a blur of red and gold and silver, caught the tang of horses and the musk of men. Even the German was difficult, and the strangest thing, how the riders of the little ponies trotting indifferently amongst the march and clatter sat hunched right up over their withers, half man, half beast. Hour upon hour the mass moved. She went in, saw to the geese, who were peevish and fevered by all the upset. Scrubbed pans, butter churns, cut bread, fed the baby, checked the little one for bruises, swept up in the kitchen. And still, when the light went down and she was wiping her hands by the window, still the armies came, as if they would come forever, until she and the oxen and the tree, printing its sundown shadow on the chapel wall, lean their crosses in the lee of an east wind, until stakes and lances and defences are dust wisp sifting over the brow of the hill. For the last 50 years or so, I've been going to France every year, and indeed I even lived in Paris for a while. And this country is one of the great loves of my life. So you may imagine what impact Brexit has had on my emotional life. Here is a poem which expresses my love for this country and my love for my husband together. It was 15 years in the gestation, and evokes an afternoon one summer in the town of Figeac, where we came across a troupe of gypsy players in the marketplace. Figeac la Belle. I remember a marketplace, oh Figeac la Belle, the bustle and laughter and summer cries, the little shimmering well. I remember a marketplace where we walked arm in arm, where branches danced and the river danced and lovers were free from harm. I remember a marketplace and how we stopped stock still. Over the breeze came music from a sudden haunting hill. Over the breeze came music. 5 men sat in a row. Jackets of green and fiddles and gold flashed from their bow. Gold flashed from their teeth and eyes and black from their sleek hair. Up and away from them flew their sound into the golden air. They bent their heads together and their feet tapped the floor. Their smile passed quick as a javelin as the sound began to soar. They struck the air together. Time and beat were one. The key and chord leapt asunder on the rarest of patterns spun. As their sound began to soar, it went into another land, and all the listeners hung on the thread thrown by their flashing hands. They bent their heads together, their feet tapped the floor. Round and round streamed the melodies out of the angel's store. The light grew long round the shadows as the song sprang to and fro, and the lovers danced to hear the sound of the player's brimming bow. In the marketplace at Figeac, 5 fiddlers threw wide the door. Our hearts flew up into a golden tree and sit there evermore. On a very cold day in January, a couple of years ago, or no, some years ago now, I went with my husband to Cambridge to see friends. And as we rounded the street corner by Corpus Christi College, we were confronted by the Corpus Christi clock, which is a mechanism displaying the workings of the so-called grasshopper escapement, with a figure of an actual grotesque locust grasshopper figure eating the rotating ratchets as they go round. Some of you may have seen this. It's also known as the chronophage, the eater of time. And we both stood there appalled by this image of time. And within a couple of years, my husband had died, and I began thinking very seriously indeed about our conceptions of time. So this is my riposte to the eater of time. The Corpus Christi clock. We stopped by the clock at the corner of time, at the turn of the year, at the coldest tide in the town on the dead fen. This dead animal moved. Carats of flagrancy and pride in its levering head, tracking pin prick, pin prick, pin prick. See the mandibles of famine snacking on the mechanism of dread. All for a measure, to measure the trains and the oceans, the billow of commerce in those blank blink eyes. Out of our own desire, the beetle comes to lay the seed in our brain. This thus is time, the chain drop of calculation and the shut box. Corpus Christi. The roll of the earth turns the frost to blood, and in the air hangs the still tree, waiting the moment in eternity for the husk to burst. From this fruit, all singularities flow. a place which has no speech for time, no place from past beyond, but is the now of footfall printing birth upon the snow of our existence, tilted into the long, low ray of grace. The camber of this life shone on your face this winter afternoon to let arrive the transfigured thing. One single span of our loved lives outflanks all reckoning at the empty corner by the sullen locust, hustled abruptly up into God's whirlwind and out into immeasurable night. Two nights before he died, my husband, who was the poet Sebastian Barker, did a poetry reading in Trinity College, Cambridge. Afterwards, there was a supper with friends and family. What a way for a poet to go. Then I had to maneuver him in his wheelchair back into the college room where we were staying. The wheelchair, of course, predictably got stuck, and the college porters, famous for their pork pie hats, came to my rescue. And this is how I thought of that encounter later. The throngs of thanksgivers who are mentioned are not, of course, actually present. They are all those from both our lives who came in spirit to sit with us in that room that night as we enjoyed a last glass of wine. The men in pork pie hats. The men in pork pie hats lifted you through the door. They had seen me struggle, though midnight was gone and the party was over. The cloisters were black with sleep, but under the eaves the young were whispering what has always been whispered in love's arms. The men in pork pie hats lifted you through the door. They had had a care for something not quite right at the end of vision and bundled to help. How they burst the room open with their red faces and burly shoulders. How round they were in their constancy. And you, happy and laughing and cracking jokes with these men so vivid they crackled the air. Oh, gentle men, extraordinary in ordinary, squaring the circle, opening the door, kind trumpeteers for the entrance of the dying, the boisterers of, let's have one more celebration, sir, kinsmen of going and wine. So the task was completed. The messengers raised their hats in acknowledgement and closed the door. For many hours then, the throngs of the thanksgivers came close about us. All said that was necessary. Repletion carried to the full cup. All the compassions of a life gathered ready for the juncture. That supreme night burning with the fruit of the honeybee. And I'm going to read two more poems and then I'll finish. For some years now, I've been going to Cornwall to write. And I always like to explore anywhere I go and find out about its history and geography. The place where I go has many deep sea inlets that go far inland, creating a secret and enchanted landscape, which is of course why it's so famous for piracy. It was ideal for smuggling goods without being seen. I discovered Pill Creek one day while out walking along the shoreline. And it's the magical meeting, indeed the multiple magical meetings that I had, that I talk about here, with trees in strange places and with a little boy. At Pill Creek. Under the secret, under the dark tree, past a scrabble of leaves and brambles and an old hoe stacked against a shed, the path sheers steep down. Children clamber and chatter as they carry their toys to the sea, inquiring like stars of the stranger. Did you see our boat at the moorings? The dark blue and white one, gold stripe. We're going to paint her. 12 rowers pass. The sea is far out on the turn. The eddy turns under the fingers of saltweed, and the black rocks turn, tilted all one way by a giant's hand. They're resting for now, but they'll be off soon. Watch the ooze underfoot. Walking the line needs care. Our edge leads along the overhang of branches. They dip, pick the tide, string catches of bladderwrack up into the breeze like shrouds. Behind us, what was that? A click, a plop, odd, like a spick every so often into the mud, insistent, particular. The water is turning. Here, look, in their thousands, brilliant green acorns dropped from the cup, ready for rooting. Into the rock pools they roll and amongst the pebbles, and the wide salt arms of the sea take them. A man drives down the causeway on the opposite bank, unloads tools carefully and crosses the plank that serves as a bridge till the sea returns. She is fingering the land now, and the boathouses are alert on their stilts. Long spools of rope suddenly snake from the mud as the keels lift. On his little boat, the fisherman is looping nets over and over, loving his craft amongst the tabernacles and landing stages. Soon we will hear his outboard motor, see its puff of rancid blue. Wood doves cluster a last moment at the sweet sauce that gushed from the gully. Remember this. Remember where it ran. A van draws up at the quayside hastily. Pa, take me with you. The chubby boy runs awkwardly across the mudbank, is lifted in, hugged and joyful for the rounding of the headland in the distance, its boundary of blue. You can help. Watch while I steady her. A start. The boat moves out upon the water. On the sea stairs, the stranger smiles and waves. Wave, do you see him? The child laughs, halloos from the top of his happiness, tiptoeing taller and taller to see the figure receding to the end of vision, arm raised over and over, each to each, under a vast heaven, till the boat at last rounds the promontory and the deep comes in. And the last poem I've chosen to read is actually a poem I wrote inspired by St. Bino's, where Hopkins was. I do retreats there every year if I can. And there's a place called St. Michael's Rock up above St. Bino's, which has a Victorian chapel on it. Probably post-dates Hopkins's time. In fact, I'm sure it does. It's a tiny little chapel at the top of, on its little sort of pimple of hills. But he used to walk up there and the views are tremendous. And the chapel is tiny inside, really only room for one person. And it has 7 very beautiful modern stained glass windows done by a lady called Claire Mulholland. So that inside it's very dark, but full of colour. And this is a poem inspired by this chapel and looking many times spent there, thinking about the different blues and reds. She does a kind of colour spectrum of the windows around the chapel. So one is blue, one is red, one is more yellow, and so on. 7 windows. 7 windows stand on St. Michael's Rock. Windmills turn in the sea. Sheep and shepherd huddle on the hill. Sap drops from the severed tree. 7 windows rise among the swarm of the rooks. The cattle carry the sky. The headland clasps the sea in its arm. The hawk tracks all in her eye. 7 windows flower to Our Lady of Sorrows. Each colour has its own sound. Blue, blue for the robes of the wood. Red for the apple's wound. 7 windows run the spokes of pity, wheel of the broken world. Purple the salve for the waste of pain and the mouths of the fledgling birds. 7 windows hold time's prism still in a silent room. A ladybird sleeps in the holy word, the dark jar of the tomb. 7 windows carry the rhythm of time itself, the tread of the entering angel, Christ's heartbeat felt. 7 windows stand on St. Michael's rock. Windmills turn in the sea. The cut bough's door bursts green crowns. The seraph towers in the tree. Thank you very much for listening, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Hilary. Thank you, Hilary. That was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Don't know if
has anyone any questions they'd like to ask about Hilary, her poetry? I enjoyed them, Hilary. I liked the personal aspect. I was kind of fascinated by the German one, the one about Prussian soldiers.
Yeah.
Like it just, why did you choose to read that one? It just didn't seem to fit with the kind of general theme of the other ones.
Well, in a way, I wanted something that was a bit different. I've written a lot of long sequences on historical and indeed even prehistoric themes. So I've written about Abelard and Eloise. I've written about Nelson and the Napoleonic Wars. So actually, there's a whole other strand of what I am interested in writing about, which in a way this poem does represent. So I could have given you a very, very different poetry reading, but it's also partly about what works in a reading, because sometimes a poem can be very interesting, but actually it's too long, or, for whatever reason, it won't work quite in a reading, for people. So you don't read them, but it doesn't mean that they're not, they don't matter to you. So there is a big historical aspect to what I write, in fact. Even though you're right, it didn't.
I suppose now when you're choosing your poems for today, with COVID and with, I suppose, that the lack of socialization, you're probably going to look more at things that are closer to you, really.
Possibly. I mean, I also did want to read some poems about Europe, because that matters to me very much. And when I first started writing that sequence on the Rhine, which was back in 2011. And I remember thinking to myself, I want to write this because the Rhine is very important to me, and for all sorts of reasons, historically and personally. And it's one of the great thoroughfares of Europe. And I remember thinking to myself, I'm writing this, well, you're writing it because you want to write it. Fair enough. That's why we always do. But who's going to be interested in this? Nobody seems to be at all interested in the Rhine these days, or Europe. Bang. and then I thought, maybe that was a bit prescient to write about why Europe might matter. the horror, and because the poem also, it's also about the horror, it's about good things and bad things that have happened on the Rhine. You know, depending on your point of view, you think it's a good idea that Blücher crossed the Rhine. But there you go.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
May I make a comment?
Certainly.
Right, Hilary. I grew up on the Lee, a little bit further north, and used to swim and sail on it, and into Epping Forest. Thank you, thank you.
Good.
Lovely, lovely. And I was just enjoying the Figure la Belle. And I remember an inn, Miranda. I remember an inn.
Oh yes, Figure la Belle.
That was lovely.
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Did you deliberately?
No, I don't think so. But my mother loved that poem, and she often used to sort of quote bits from it. I suppose there's a whole ballad form. That poem, rather unusually, came to me almost fully formed. Most poems don't come to poets fully formed. It's unusual, and that one kind of came really fast, you know, over a very short period, and with almost all the rhymes just kept on suggesting themselves as natural rhymes without forcing them, you know. But it had been, that's why I mentioned the gestation, but it had been sitting in the back of my mind for 15 years. So poems often do, of course. So whether it was just like a gestation thing, and once it was ready, it just kind of went pop, pop, pop. Don't know. Yeah.
Can I say about your Blücher poem? I was more than surprised to hear a poem with a reference to Blücher. I have another existence as a reenactor, and I've not the reenacting of the Battle of Waterloo. And
yes, right.
Poor Blücher, I think, is only beginning to receive the recognition now that he deserved. You know,
without Blücher, we probably wouldn't have won Waterloo. And that's another reason why I wanted to talk about him, because Blücher's story is astonishing. You know how old he was when he rode across Europe from his estate in what is now Poland to Belgium, which is quite a long way. You know, even in a car or a train,
very elderly, yes.
It takes you a day or more in a train to do that journey on horseback with an army. He was 72 years old.
Gosh.
And full of brandy.
Yeah, extraordinary. Just an extraordinary achievement. And then, of course, which I don't talk about in there, but it's very sad that at the end of the Second World War, his estate, of course, was wrecked by the Russians, quite understandably, and his grave was desecrated because, of course, he was a German to them. So that there are the unnice twists and turns of history. Yeah.
I was in the town where he was born, and they have a monument to him, but they had the council of the day had great difficulty raising funds to erect the monument. Yeah. It's people's lack of understanding of history is really quite, and that's another reason, in a way, why I wanted to write this poem about the Rhine, because England is enormously dependent on the Rhine, and always has been. And people don't even think of it like that. They may think of Europe occasionally, but they don't understand that the Rhine and the Thames are both tributaries of the same ancient river.
Yes, yes,
very.
Yes, 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 yes.
Could I return to the Golden Grove? Jill, you remember Lawrence Pearson bringing us around Stratford and the reference to Golden Grove. There was a pub there, I remember.
Yes.
Is Miho still with us? Miho and myself had a pint in that pub. They claimed to be the location, or adjacent to the location of the poem, Golden Grove. I don't know if you remember that, do you?
I do remember, yes. It's just opposite the place where Hopkins was born, in Stratford.
Yes.
Yes, and indeed I do remember. I have no idea how all that fits together. I think there was somewhere called Golden Grove there, and of course there may be that kind of chiming of a house that he remembers opposite, and visiting the place in Whitby. I mean, these things chime together, don't they?
They do, really, yes.
May I? Hilary, thank you for that very exciting selection.
Oh, it's lovely.
A lovely sense of familiar being in your head and physically in the place. There's a very strong sense of that. But a funny question. How do you decide, because I have this problem a lot, how do you decide when you've finished a poem? I go on tickling them forever.
Yeah. What is it Eliot famously said? You don't finish a poem, you merely abandon it. You know.
Oh, okay, fair enough.
That's one way of looking at the problem.
Okay, I'll have to live with that.
Sometimes you really do know, or at least I do. It just kind of clicks. There's another, you know, to counteract Mr. Eliot, there's a lovely phrase by Yeats somewhere where he talks about, or is it even Auden? Oh dear, that's an appalling thing to be unsure about. One or other of them, perhaps it's more Auden, this image, that it just goes click and everything goes click like a box shutting. And you know, it snaps shut and you know it's done. But there are others where you're never quite sure that you've finished it.
Quite.
Yeah.
Yes, is it abandoning, or is it just letting them go forth into the world on their own without you?
I very rarely do any kind of substantial changes to a poem once I've finished it, which means I'm working on a poem until I think it's as close as I can to abandonment, and then I won't go back. Whereas some poets notoriously fiddle with their stuff years later, you know, and rewrite large chunks. I never do that. If I have decided that it is done, it is pretty much done. Because what you're interested in and your life experience, of course, then come in between. No, I couldn't, you know, you can't write the poems that you wrote when you were younger, when you are, you know, in your 50s, and vice versa. Yeah.
Quite.
That's
something Wordsworth should have understood.
Well, that's I like that, because yes, all the experiences you've had of a great variety,
correct,
things you come across that you could not have come across as a younger person.
Quite so.
And they're all kind of, well, I always feel that you make your history, you tell yourself your history as you go along, and you're picking up all sorts of things.
Yes, exactly
right.
Making
your history as you go along.
Exactly, and reinterpreting it, sometimes reinterpreting it in the light of things that have occurred subsequently.
Yes.
You know, the past does change, contrary to what people think. It does shift. So all of those things, yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you. It's nice.
Well, folks, I think, have we any further questions or any more contributions? Dan?
Yeah. Dan, yeah.
You're muted, Dan. You may unmute. Sorry, Dan, we can't hear you. Your mute button is on. Good, yes. Go ahead now, Dan.
I'd just like to say that it is today, this morning's session has been one of the most relaxed, interesting, convivial and intimate occasions that we've had in our Hopkins festivals here in Monasterevin. And thanks to Will and Hilary for their wonderful contributions and for the creation of a wonderful atmosphere here this morning.
Lovely.
Yes.
What I would like to ask Hilary would be, have you considered a poem on Boris and Brexit?
My Rhine fugue is my riposte to Boris and Brexit, and I wrote it before it happened. Yeah, I don't think, yes, quite. I leave that to others better qualified than myself.
But I was just
possibly in better control of their emotions as well.
It was very interesting, Irene, your observation there on Hopkins's seemingly preferred upper class connections and what have you. When you think of his sojourn in Ireland here,
Yes,
it was a most painful and upsetting sojourn that he had, with the exception of his visits to the Miss Cassidys in Monasterevin.
Yeah.
I suppose.
and Judge
Dan, may I interrupt you, Dan, and say I wasn't talking in terms of preferred. What I had, sorry to correct you, what I had said, what I had observed, was that I had read quite a lot, and you know, there might be more about it. I don't know. What I had read was more about the working congregation that he had been speaking to and working with.
Yes.
And there was much more about that than there was about the owners of the companies and places and so on. That's all, yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit stressing to read of his observations to Bridges about his sojourn in Dublin, that it was the most miserable time. I suppose the only good thing that came out of it in one way was his terrible sonnets.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Oh, more than that. Yes. Yes. Yes.
Yes, I think. Go on. Yes, sorry.
At the international conference a few weeks ago, somebody looked at the numbers of times he had gone and stayed somewhere rural when he was in Dublin, and it was a huge number. I was astonished at how often he was going out to Monasterevin, to Howth, and other places to get away from it. Yeah. So he got to know lots of he was desperate for some kind of rural balm, it seemed, which he got in Monasterevin, in Howth, and in other places.
He wrote to Bridges on February the 17th, 1887, and I quote, "Tomorrow morning I shall have been I've been 3 years in Ireland, 3 hard, wearying, wasted years."
Yes.
Very, very, very sad.
It is sad. It is sad.
I think, you know, he was brought up in Hampstead. Hampstead is a very leafy suburb.
Yes.
It would have been, even in those days, probably classified as a suburb of London. But you know, even now, it's kind of not London. It both is and isn't London. And I think, and then Oxford, Roehampton, of course, would have been in the country. I think he was. It's obvious that he really wasn't an inner city man.
No,
and
he wasn't.
Certainly not an inner city slum man.
Yeah.
I don't think it's, because he took a superior attitude. I think it was just his personality found it very tough to cope with that sort of thing, basically.
Yeah.
Even though he knew he had to.
Yes. Yes.
On March the 7th, 1884, he writes to Bridges again, and he says, "The house we are in, the college, is a sort of ruin, and for purposes of study, very nearly naked. And I have more money to buy books than room to put them in."
I think it was Spartan, but I mean, Spartan he was used to. I don't think Spartan bothered him. I think slum and deprivation bothered him.
Yes. And people who he couldn't reach.
Yeah.
Perhaps he just didn't have an empathy with them, but he struggled to reach them.
Yeah.
Perhaps Felix Randall is an expression of that frustration and that desperation to reach people. I don't know, that's just off the top of my head.
And I also think you have to remember he's very Ruskinian and he's very Mauritian, and he believes in return to the good workman who produces good quality work. He's although I don't know if he actually says that anywhere, but he's very much not in the spirit of the mass manufacture and what it does to the human spirit. Whereas, you know, you notice he talks about a ploughman, a farrier. The only one that who isn't is Tom's Garland. I think Tom is a miner. So they're people who are they're still artisans who are close to nature, if you like, close to the soil. He doesn't write about, you know, the wool mills of Lancashire, or the, you know, the cotton mills of Lancashire.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
There's a different way round as well to consider it without being flippant. If you were one of the priests in sharing the priest's house with Hopkins in Liverpool, you might have found him quite tiring. You know,
I think so. Yes.
I
so
think
the fact that he was being dispatched to the provinces to say mass might also reflect the fact that sometimes the priests wanted a Hopkins break.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean,
you're right there.
Oh my God.
He's a man to be admired, not lived with, I suspect.
Yes, at a distance, Hilary.
Yes, definitely. Yes, I think he and his sort of obsessive, you know, interest in detail must have driven them up the wall. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well done. We'll remember you for that phrase.
Yes, indeed. I think that's right.
Oh dear. Yeah.
Well,
Michael, might I do a very small puff piece for our UK Hopkins Society journal that's just about, will be out very shortly, which is on Hopkins and other writers, of which James Harper is one of the people, and Dudley's written a review of Will Dauncey, but we're talking about Hopkins and other writers, and there's lots of reflections on how his sonnets, of both the terrible ones and the other ones, have affected people. It'll be on our website. Come and buy a copy of it.
That's very good, Del. We'll do that.
And our next one is going to be about Hopkins and words.
Excellent.
And yes.
Excellent.
Excellent, Del. Thank you for bringing it to our attention. Do we think it's time to maybe